The modern conflict between the United States and Iran didn't start with a hostage crisis. It started with oil and a coup. In 1953, the United States helped overthrow the democratically elected leader of Iran. 26 years later, Iranian revolutionaries stormed the United States Embassy and took American diplomats hostage. Those two events are connected. But to understand how, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to oil, back to empire. Back to a moment when Iran tried to take control of its own future. Iran sits on some of the largest oil reserves on Earth. But in the early 20th century, that wealth did not truly belong to Iran. At the time, Iran was a constitutional monarchy. There was a king, the Shah, but there was also an elected parliament known as the Majlis, and a prime minister governed through that political system. On paper, it looked like a balance of power. A king, a parliament, a government chosen through political debate. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Because the most valuable resource in the country, oil, was largely controlled by a foreign company. And many Iranians believed their country's wealth was leaving their country. That company was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British corporation, the company that would later become BP. It controlled Iran's oil production and operated the massive Abadan refinery, one of the largest refineries in the world at the time. The oil came from Iran, the labor came from Iranian workers, but the profits mostly went to Britain. Iran received only a small share of the revenue. To many Iranians, the arrangement looked deeply unfair, and the inequality wasn't just economic. At Abadan, Iranian workers often lived in company housing without running water. British managers lived in separate neighborhoods with modern homes, swimming pools, and private clubs. In some cases, Iranian workers were even barred from using the same dining halls and recreational facilities as British staff. To many people in Iran, the oil industry began to look less like a partnership and more like colonialism. And by the early 1950s, the imbalance was becoming impossible to ignore, especially after another oil-producing country secured a much better deal. In 1950, Saudi Arabia negotiated a 50-50 profit agreement with American oil companies. Iran had nothing like that. Instead, a foreign corporation still controlled most of its valuable natural resources. And inside Iran's parliament, a political movement began to grow around one man. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was not a revolutionary in the way people often imagine. He was an aristocrat, educated in Europe, a lawyer and a political reformer, and a believer in constitutional government and a parliamentary democracy. But he was also a nationalist, and he believed in something simple. Iran's oil should benefit Iran. For Mossadegh, this wasn't about ideology. It was about sovereignty. Who controlled the country's resources, and who decided its future? In 1951, he became Iran's Prime Minister. Soon after taking office, he made a decision that would shake the global oil industry. In 1951, Iran's parliament voted to nationalize the oil industry. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company would no longer control Iranian oil. The fields, the refineries, the infrastructure, all of it would now belong to Iran. For millions of Iranians, the moment felt historic. Crowds celebrated in the streets. Mossadegh became a national hero. For the first time, many believed their country was reclaiming its own wealth. But in London, the reaction was very different. Because Britain had just lost control of one of the most valuable oil operations on Earth. The Abadan refinery alone processed enormous amounts of petroleum that fueled British industry and military power. And now, that entire system had been taken away. Britain responded with economic pressure. They imposed sanctions. They organized a global boycott of Iranian oil. They froze Iranian financial assets. And they pressured other countries not to buy Iranian petroleum. Iran's economy began to suffer. Oil exports dropped dramatically. Political tensions rose. But Mossadegh refused to reverse the nationalization. Britain even considered military action to seize the Abadan refinery. But after World War II, its global power had weakened. The British Empire was shrinking, and launching a new military intervention on Iran carried serious risks. So Britain turned to a new ally, the United States. By the early 1950s, the Cold War was intensifying. American leaders feared the spread of Soviet influence. Iran shared a long border with the Soviet Union, and instability inside the country raised alarm in Washington. So in 1953, the United States and Britain supported a covert operation to remove Mossadegh from power. The operation had a name: Operation Ajax. But the coup did not look like tanks rolling through the streets. It looked like chaos. Propaganda flooded newspapers. Money was secretly distributed to politicians and street groups. Protests erupted across Tehran. One of the key figures behind the operation was CIA officer Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. Working with Iranian generals and political allies, he helped coordinate efforts to destabilize Mossadegh's government. At one point, the plan nearly failed. The Shah fled the country, and it briefly appeared that Mossadegh had survived the attempt to remove him. But the pressure continued. Protests grew larger. Military units loyal to the Shah moved into position. And within days, Mossadegh's home was surrounded. His government collapsed. The Prime Minister was arrested, and the coup succeeded. After the coup, power consolidated around Iran's monarch, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. The Shah had already been king, but now with strong support from the United States and Britain, his authority expanded dramatically. Iran became a key Western ally in the Middle East. Oil production resumed under a new international consortium of Western companies. The Shah launched major modernization programs known as the White Revolution. Industry expanded. Infrastructure grew. Education programs spread across the country. But political opposition was tightly controlled. Critics were jailed, and the Shah's security service, Savak, became notorious for surveillance and repression. To Western leaders, the Shah looked like stability. To many Iranians, he looked like a ruler whose power had been restored by foreign intervention. And resentment slowly grew. Year after year, decade after decade, until finally, it exploded. In 1979, Iran erupted in revolution. Mass protests filled the streets. The Shah fled the country, and a revolutionary movement led by Ruhollah Khomeini took power. Iran transformed from a monarchy into an Islamic republic. Soon after, Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. American diplomats were taken hostage. The crisis lasted 444 days. For Americans, this moment defined Iran. But for many Iranians, the story began much earlier. With Mossadegh, with the coup, with 1953. History rarely disappears. It lingers. It echoes across generations. The relationship between Iran and the United States was shaped not just by revolution and not just by hostages. It was shaped by oil, by foreign intervention, and by a coup. Because for many Iranians, 1953 was the wound. 1979 was the scar. And decades later, the injury still hasn't fully healed. If you're still here, thanks. I've got more stories like this that our history textbooks left out. Drop a like, hit subscribe, and welcome to the Underground Syllabus.